The morning sun cast long shadows across the coral atoll of Midway. As Admiral Chester William Nimitz studied the intercepted Japanese communications one final time. It was June 4, 1942, and the most crucial naval battle of the Pacific War was about to begin. Unknown to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his formidable combined fleet, American codebreakers had shattered the Japanese naval cipher, revealing the enemy's intention to seize Midway Island and draw the Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet, spearheaded by 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating fortresses had participated in the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and their veteran pilots represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The carriers approached Midway with supreme confidence, their decks loaded with Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3 of Aldive bombers, and the feared Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since the war began. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Nagumo felt the weight of expectation pressing upon his shoulders. Yamamoto's plan called for a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands, while the main force would crush American resistance at Midway, then advance toward Hawaii. The Japanese admiral believed he faced only a handful of American ships, unaware that Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16 and Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17 lay in wait northeast of the atoll. The American forces were dramatically outnumbered, but possessed two critical advantages: foreknowledge of Japanese intentions and the element of surprise. Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance's command, along with Yorktown under Fletcher's direct control, represented America's last hope in the Central Pacific. The hastily repaired Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month prior, had been declared ready for combat after emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor. That should have taken months, but were completed in just 72 hours. As dawn broke on June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Island itself. 108 aircraft roared off the carrier decks, their engines creating a thunderous symphony of war. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation toward the distant atoll, unaware that American radar operators had detected the incoming threat while the Japanese planes were still 150 miles away. According to historical records from the Naval War College Review, the Japanese strike force was spotted by American reconnaissance aircraft at approximately 600 hours local time on Midway. Marine fighters scrambled to meet the threat, but the outdated Brewster Buffalo aircraft were no match for the superior Zeros. The Japanese bombers methodically pounded the island's facilities, though they failed to knock out the crucial airfield. More importantly, Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses completely. This single message would prove to be the catalyst for Japan's greatest naval disaster. Nagumo faced a critical decision: should he immediately launch his reserve aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs against any American ships that might appear, or should he rearm them with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway? The admiral chose the latter course, a decision that would cost him precious time and ultimately his entire fleet. Unknown to the Japanese, American dive bombers were already airborne and racing toward their targets. Admiral Nagumo's fateful order to rearm his aircraft for a second strike against Midway Island set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of the Pacific War, as armament crews aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu frantically worked to replace anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs with high-explosive ordnance designed for land targets. American reconnaissance aircraft were painting an increasingly clear picture of the Japanese fleet's position. At 7:28 in the morning, a Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the Japanese carriers, approximately 175 miles southwest of Midway. Reed's electrifying report crackled across the radio waves, many planes heading Midway. Bearing 320 degrees, distance 150. Minutes later, another search plane confirmed the sighting of two Japanese carriers, though the actual number was twice that figure. Aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made the bold decision to launch his strike aircraft immediately. Despite being at the extreme limit of their operational range, the American admiral understood that timing was everything in carrier warfare, and he sensed an opportunity that might not come again. At 7:52, Enterprise began launching her aircraft, followed shortly by Hornet. Within 2 hours, 116 American dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters were winging their way toward the Japanese fleet. The scene aboard the Japanese carriers presented a stark contrast to the focused urgency of the American launch. Nagumo's crews worked feverishly to complete the rearming process, but the task was complicated and time-consuming. Torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the hangar decks as ordnance crews struggled to complete their work. At 7:15, just as the rearming was nearing completion, a reconnaissance aircraft from the cruiser Tone reported the presence of American ships to the northeast. This intelligence struck Nagumo like a thunderbolt. The presence of American naval forces had not been anticipated, and their exact composition remained unclear. Were they merely cruisers and destroyers, or did the enemy force include the precious aircraft carriers that Yamamoto so desperately wanted to destroy? The Japanese admiral faced an agonizing dilemma: continue with the planned second strike against Midway, or immediately rearm his aircraft once again with anti-ship weapons to deal with this unexpected threat. Nagumo's vacillation proved costly beyond measure. At 7:45, he ordered his crews to stop the rearming process and prepare for an anti-ship strike instead. This meant removing the high-explosive bombs that had just been loaded and replacing them with the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that had been removed earlier. The Japanese carriers became floating powder kegs, their hangar decks cluttered with volatile ordnance and fuel lines. Meanwhile, the first American attack was already approaching its target. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led 16 Army Air Force Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers in a high-altitude attack on the Japanese carriers. Though their bombs fell harmlessly into the ocean, the mere presence of American aircraft confirmed to Nagumo that he faced a serious threat. More attacks would surely follow. The complexity of the Japanese dilemma has been extensively documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official History of United States Naval Operations. During World War II. At 9:18, 6 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway Island began their low-level approach toward the Japanese fleet. These modern aircraft, along with 4 Army B-26 Marauder bombers also configured for torpedo attack, represented some of the most advanced American aviation technology available in 1942. However, they faced overwhelming odds against the experienced Japanese fighter pilots and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the entire combined fleet. The American torpedo attack was courageously pressed home, but ultimately futile. All 6 Avengers were shot down along with 2 of the Marauders. The sole surviving Avenger, piloted by Ensign Albert Ernest, limped back to Midway with its hydraulic system destroyed and its gunner dead. The Japanese fleet emerged unscathed, but these preliminary attacks served a crucial purpose. They kept Nagumo's fighters at low altitude and forced him to maintain his defensive formation, rather than launching his own strike aircraft. The morning sky above the Pacific grew heavy with the promise of carnage as Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet approached the Japanese fleet. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flew steadily toward their targets. At wave-top height, their crews knowing that their obsolete aircraft offered little hope against the formidable Japanese defenses. Waldron, a Part Sioux warrior from South Dakota, had briefed his men with characteristic bluntness: "We'll go in and attack regardless of consequences." The Devastators represented American naval aviation's first generation of carrier-based torpedo bombers, but by June 1942, they were hopelessly outclassed by modern fighters and anti-aircraft systems. Their maximum speed of just over 100 miles per hour made them sitting ducks for the nimble Zeros, while their single defensive machine gun provided inadequate protection against attacking fighters. Most critically, the Mark 13 torpedoes they carried were plagued with mechanical failures and required long, straight runs at low altitude that exposed the bombers to devastating enemy fire. At 9:20 in the morning, Zero fighters from the Combat Air Patrol spotted the approaching American torpedo bombers. Lieutenant Commander Shigeo Itaya, the same pilot who had led the first wave against Pearl Harbor, coordinated the Japanese fighter response with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, Zeros were diving on the slow-moving devastators from multiple directions, their 20mm cannons and machine guns ripping through the American formation. Waldron's squadron pressed forward with suicidal determination. One by one, the TBD aircraft fell burning into the Pacific, their crews trapped in cockpits that had become flaming coffins. Ensign George Gay, piloting the last remaining devastator, watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft, riddled with cannon shells, finally crashed into the ocean just short of the Japanese carriers. Gay survived the impact and spent the next 30 hours floating in his life jacket, witnessing the battle from the water while hiding beneath a seat cushion. Whenever Japanese aircraft passed overhead, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise met a similarly tragic fate. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 devastators toward the Japanese fleet, but Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 10 of his aircraft. Before they could launch their torpedoes, the 4 survivors managed to drop their weapons but scored no hits on the frantically maneuvering Japanese carriers. Only 4 crew members from the entire squadron survived the attack. Military historians, including those at the United States Naval Institute, have extensively documented the sacrifice of these torpedo squadrons as one of the most heroic episodes in American naval history. The final act in this tragedy belonged to Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 devastators toward the enemy fleet, escorted by 6 Wildcat fighters commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, now reinforced and battle-tested from the previous attacks, fell upon the American formation with overwhelming force. Massey's aircraft was among the first to fall, its pilot killed instantly by cannon fire. The escort fighters, though vastly outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. Thatch employed his innovative weave tactic, allowing his Wildcats to provide mutual support against the superior Zeros. However, the mathematics of aerial combat worked against the Americans. For every Zero shot down, multiple American aircraft fell burning into the Pacific. Of the 12 devastators in Torpedo Squadron 3, only to survive to return to Yorktown, and neither had managed to score a torpedo hit dot in less than an hour. 3 entire American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. Of 41 devastators that had attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 returned to their carriers, and most of these were so heavily damaged as to be beyond immediate repair. 109 American airmen had died in the space of 60 minutes, their sacrifice seemingly meaningless as the Japanese carriers continued their evasive maneuvers. Without suffering a single hit, Admiral Nagumo surveyed the wreckage of the American torpedo attacks with grim satisfaction. His Combat Air Patrol had performed magnificently, and his carriers remained unscathed despite the determined American efforts. The obsolete American torpedo bombers had posed no real threat to his modern fleet, and their destruction seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their tactical superiority. However, the sustained attacks had forced Nagumo to keep his fighters at low altitude and his fleet in defensive formation. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, this tactical success contained the seeds of strategic disaster. While his Zeros were busy slaughtering the torpedo bombers at sea level, American dive bombers were approaching from high altitude, undetected and unopposed. High above the carnage unfolding at sea level, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. led 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. In a desperate search for the Japanese fleet, the American Air Group commander had been airborne for over 2 hours, burning precious fuel as he scoured the empty Pacific for targets that seemed to have vanished into the morning haze. McCluskey's fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and his radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports from pilots. whose engines were beginning to sputter from empty tanks. The Enterprise dive bombers had initially flown toward the position where the Japanese carriers were expected to be, but found only empty ocean. Unknown to McCluskey, Admiral Nagumo had ordered a course change to the northeast while recovering his fighters from the abortive Midway strike and preparing for his own attack on the American fleet. This alteration in heading had taken the Japanese carriers away from their predicted position, leaving the American pilots searching vast expanses of barren sea. At 10:15 in the morning, just as McCluskey was preparing to order his formation to return to Enterprise before their fuel ran out completely, his keen eyes spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward across the water. The vessel was Arashi, which had been delayed after dropping depth charges on the American submarine Nautilus. The destroyer's white wake stretched across the blue Pacific, like an arrow pointing directly toward the Japanese fleet. McCluskey made the critical decision to follow the destroyer's course, gambling his pilots' lives on the assumption that the enemy ship was rejoining its fleet. His intuition proved correct. At 10:22, the Enterprise dive bombers crested a cloud bank and beheld one of the most magnificent sights in naval warfare, for Japanese aircraft carriers spread across the ocean below them, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch against the American fleet. The timing was nothing short of miraculous. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the final preparations for the anti-ship strike were nearing completion. Nakajima K torpedo bombers and Aichi Val dive bombers crowded the flight decks, their engines warming up for launch. Fuel lines snaked across the deck plates, and ordnance crews made last-minute adjustments to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Most crucially, the Japanese combat air patrol remained at low altitude after dealing with the torpedo attacks, leaving the carriers virtually defenseless against high-altitude threats. The precise timing of this attack has been analyzed extensively by military historians, with Gordon Prange's definitive account in Miracle at Midway providing detailed documentation of the crucial moments. McCluskey quickly assessed the tactical situation and divided his force between the two nearest carriers. He led his own squadron of 18 dive bombers toward Kaga, while directing Lieutenant Dick Best's squadron toward Akagi. The American pilots pushed over into their dives from 14,000 feet, their dauntless aircraft accelerating toward terminal velocity as they plunged through the morning air. Aboard Kaga, lookouts finally spotted the incoming dive bombers, but it was far too late to take effective action. The carrier's captain ordered an emergency turn to port, but the massive ship responded slowly to her rudder. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of flak, but the American pilots pressed their attacks with the precision of veteran aviators. The first bomb struck Kaga near the island's superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft spotted below. The detonation ignited aviation fuel and caused a sympathetic explosion among the armed aircraft, creating a chain reaction that raced across the hangar deck. Within seconds, Kaga was transformed from a proud warship into a blazing inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Best led his three-plane section against Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese carrier force. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier just aft of the midship's elevator, punching through the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft below. Like her sister ship, Akagi erupted in flames as aviation gasoline and ordnance cooked off in a series of devastating secondary explosions. In the space of 5 minutes, 2 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers had been mortally wounded. The pride of the Imperial Navy, veterans of Pearl Harbor, and a dozen other victorious battles, were dying beneath columns of black smoke that rose thousands of feet into the morning sky. The miracle at 10:22 had begun, and the course of the Pacific War was about to change forever. As Akagi and Kaga writhed in their death agonies, spewing pillars of black smoke into the pristine Pacific sky, the third act of this aerial drama was unfolding 30 miles to the east. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 dive bombers from Yorktown toward the carrier Soryu, which had somehow escaped the initial American attack. The Japanese ship steamed desperately through the azure waters, her crew manning anti-aircraft stations while her captain threw the vessel into violent evasive maneuvers. Leslie's approach to Soryu differed markedly from the Enterprise attack on Akagi and Kaga. The Yorktown Air Group had maintained better formation integrity during their flight to the target, and their attack was more coordinated and deliberate. At 10:25, Leslie pushed over into his dive from 14,700 feet, leading his dauntless bombers in a textbook attack that would have made their peacetime instructors proud. The first bomb struck Soryu forward of the island's superstructure, smashing through the flight deck and detonating among the aircraft in the forward hangar bay. The explosion ignited a massive fuel fire that spread rapidly throughout the ship's interior spaces. Subsequent hits devastated the carrier's machinery spaces and caused catastrophic structural damage. Within minutes, Soryu was blazing as fiercely as her sister ships, her crew abandoning their posts as flames consumed the vessel from stem to stern. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed by the disaster unfolding around him. 3 of his 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks buckled and twisted by internal explosions. The carefully planned strike against the American fleet, which should have been launching at this very moment, lay in ruins along with the aircraft and aircrews that were to have carried it out. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators were dead or dying, their expertise irreplaceable in a war that had suddenly turned against the rising sun. The scene aboard the dying carriers defied description. Akagi's hangar deck had become a vision of hell, with aviation fuel burning in rivers of fire that flowed between the twisted wreckage of aircraft. Ammunition continued to explode in sympathetic detonations, sending shrapnel ricocheting through the ship's interior spaces. Captain Taijiro Aoki fought desperately to save his vessel, but the fires had spread beyond any hope of control. At 10:46, he gave the order to abandon ship, though Akagi would continue burning for hours before finally being scuttled by Japanese destroyers. Kaga's fate proved even more dramatic. The massive carrier, converted from a battleship hull in the 1920s, carried enormous quantities of aviation fuel and ordnance. The fires aboard the ship created a positive feedback loop, with each explosion feeding the flames that caused the next detonation. Her island's superstructure collapsed into the inferno, and her flight deck peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. At 7:25 that evening, Kaga's magazines finally detonated in a blast that could be seen for 50 miles, sending the carrier to the bottom of the Pacific along with 111 of her crew. Naval historians have noted that the loss of these 3 carriers in the span of 5 minutes represented the most devastating defeat in the history of carrier warfare as documented in the official Japanese war history Senshi Sosho. Soryu's destruction followed a similar pattern, though her smaller size meant that the fires consumed her more quickly than the larger fleet carriers. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with his ship, last seen standing at attention on the bridge as flames engulfed the carrier round him. His sacrifice embodied the samurai spirit that had driven the Japanese fleet to early victories, but which could not overcome the material realities of modern naval warfare. By 11 o'clock that morning, 3/4 of Japan's striking power in the Central Pacific had been eliminated. The veteran aircrews, who had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months, were dead, along with their irreplaceable aircraft. More than 2,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had perished in the space of a few hours, their deaths marking the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Yet one Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu had been steaming separately from her sister ships and had escaped the American dive bomber attacks through sheer fortune. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, embarked aboard Hiryu as commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, was not a man to accept defeat passively. As smoke rose from his burning consorts, he was already planning a counterattack that would demonstrate that Japanese naval aviation still possessed the power to strike back at its tormentors. The Battle of Midway was far from over, and Yamaguchi intended to ensure that American celebration would be premature. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge, his weathered face set in grim determination as he surveyed the funeral pyres that had once been the pride of the Japanese Navy. The 50-year-old commander was widely regarded as one of Japan's most brilliant naval tacticians, a man who combined traditional samurai values with a modern understanding of naval aviation. Unlike many of his contemporaries who had risen through the battleship navy, Yamaguchi understood that aircraft carriers had become the dominant weapons of Pacific warfare. At 11:30 that morning, Yamaguchi ordered the launch of Hiryu's first strike against the American fleet. 18 Aichi Valdive bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, roared off the carrier's deck under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the carrier Yorktown, whose position had been reported by a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft circling the American task force. For Yamaguchi, this was more than mere retaliation. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. The Japanese strike found Yorktown at 12:10 in the afternoon, just as the American carrier was recovering her returning dive bombers from the morning attack on the Japanese fleet. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his ship to general quarters, but there was insufficient time to properly prepare for the incoming assault. Combat air patrol fighters scrambled to intercept the Japanese formation, but several dive bombers penetrated the defensive screen. Kobayashi's pilots executed their attack with the professional skill that characterized Japanese naval aviation. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, causing severe damage to the carrier's flight deck and starting fires in the ship's interior spaces. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck near the island and exploded on the hangar deck below, destroying several aircraft and starting a gasoline fire. A second hit ruptured the ship's uptakes, filling the engineering spaces with smoke and forcing a reduction in speed. The third bomb struck near the forward elevator, causing additional structural damage and casualties. For 40 minutes, Yorktown's damage control parties fought to save their ship. The fires were gradually brought under control, and emergency repairs restored the carrier to limited operational status. By 1:30, Yorktown was making 20 knots and preparing to resume flight operations, a testament to American damage control expertise and the determination of her crew. The resilience of American damage control procedures during World War II has been extensively documented in naval engineering studies, particularly in the work of the Bureau of Ships' Wartime Damage Reports. Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1:31 that afternoon, he launched Hiryu's second and final strike, 10 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had commanded the morning attack on Midway Island. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged during the earlier mission, but he volunteered to lead this crucial attack despite his fuel tank having been punctured by American gunfire. The Japanese torpedo bombers approached Yorktown from multiple directions, a classic anvil attack designed to force the target to present a favorable angle to at least some of the attacking aircraft. American fighter pilots fought desperately to break up the formation, but several Kate bombers penetrated to torpedo release position. At 2:44, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing catastrophic flooding and a severe list that brought flight operations to a complete halt. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandon ship at 3 o'clock, believing that his vessel was doomed. Yorktown's crew transferred to escorting destroyers as the carrier lay dead in the water. Her flight deck canted at a dangerous angle, however. The ship's buoyancy proved greater than expected, and she remained afloat despite the severe damage. Later that afternoon, a salvage party would reboard the carrier and attempt to save her, though their efforts would ultimately prove futile. Yamaguchi's strikes had achieved a measure of tactical success, but the strategic situation remained hopeless. Hiryu now stood alone against the combined might of Enterprise and Hornet, both of which were preparing their own retaliatory strikes. The Japanese admiral knew that his ship's destruction was inevitable, but he was determined to sell her dearly. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific, he prepared for the final act of his naval career. The last functioning Japanese carrier in the Central Pacific continued steaming eastward, her flight deck nearly empty of aircraft. Her crew, aware that they faced overwhelming odds, Yamaguchi had played his final cards, and now he could only await the American response. The Battle of Midway was entering its climactic phase, and the fate of Hiryu hung in the balance as enemy dive bombers began forming up for what would prove to be the coup de grace of Japanese naval aviation in the Central Pacific. The sun had begun its westward descent when 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, spotted the lone Japanese carrier Hiryu steaming desperately through the Pacific swells. It was 5 o'clock on the afternoon of June 4, 1942, and the final act of the greatest carrier battle in history was about to commence. Admiral Yamaguchi had fought brilliantly with the limited resources at his disposal, but the mathematics of naval warfare were inexorably working against him. Hiryu presented a tragic sight to the approaching American pilots. Her flight deck was virtually empty of aircraft, most having been expended in the desperate strikes against Yorktown. Fuel lines and ordnance handling equipment lay scattered across the deck, evidence of the frantic preparations that had preceded the earlier attacks. The carrier's escort of destroyers and cruisers formed a protective screen round their flagship, their anti-aircraft guns training skyward as the American formation approached from 14,000 feet. Gallagher divided his attack force with the precision of an experienced combat leader. His own squadron of 14 dive bombers would attack from the northeast, while Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led the remaining 10 aircraft in a coordinated assault. From a different vector, the two-pronged attack was designed to overwhelm Hiryu's defenses and ensure that at least some bombs found their target. Regardless of the carrier's evasive maneuvering. At 5:03, the American dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, their engines screaming as they plunged toward the Japanese carrier at terminal velocity. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the enemy formation, filling the sky with black bursts of flak and the red tracery of machine gun bullets. The Japanese gunners were well-trained and experienced, but they faced the same impossible geometry that had doomed their own carriers earlier that morning. Dive bombers attacking from high altitude were nearly impossible to stop. Once they had committed to their attack runs, the first bomb struck Hiryu forward of her island's superstructure, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay below. The detonation ignited aviation fuel and caused a chain reaction among the ordnance stored in the hangar spaces. 3 more bombs followed in rapid succession, each hit compounding the damage and spreading the fires that were beginning to consume the carrier. From within, the destruction of Hiryu marked the end of Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific. As noted in official Imperial Navy records preserved in the Japanese Defense Ministry archives, Admiral Yamaguchi watched his flagship die around him with the stoic acceptance of a samurai warrior. The fires spreading through Hiryu's interior spaces could not be controlled with the resources available, and the carrier's list was increasing steadily as seawater poured through bomb-damaged hull plates. At 7:15, he sent his final message to Admiral Yamamoto: "Hiryu burning. We are preparing to abandon ship. We have no more aircraft to launch." The evacuation of Hiryu proceeded with the discipline that characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the war. Wounded sailors were evacuated first, followed by non-essential personnel. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku chose to remain aboard their dying ship, honoring the ancient tradition that required commanders to share the fate of their vessels. Both officers were last seen standing at attention on the bridge as flames engulfed the carrier around them. At 2:30 the following morning, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull to prevent her capture by American forces. The carrier sank in 17,000 feet of water, carrying with her the bodies of 416 officers and men, including 2 of Japan's most capable naval commanders. Her destruction marked the end of the mobile force that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect 6 months earlier. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, though scattered actions would continue for several more days. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and more than 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced naval aviators. American losses were severe but manageable: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 307 men. More importantly, the United States, had retained the strategic initiative in the Pacific and would never relinquish. As dawn broke on June 5th, the wreckage of Japan's once mighty carrier fleet lay scattered across the ocean floor, while the surviving American ships turned toward Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, but the outcome had been decided in the skies above a small coral atoll called Midway. Japan's carrier fleet had indeed faced extinction at the hands of Midway's dive bombers, and from that extinction would emerge American victory in the Pacific.